Throughout the days, we take our 2 dogs outside to their kennels so they can get out of the house for a while, run, and play and such. And these are not small dogs. One is a black lab husky mix. The other one is a full-blooded Stafford Terrier. The kennels are placed at the edge of the yard near the woods. And these woods are big, large enough to take a day to go hiking through them. Lately, when it gets dark, the dogs seem on edge, and they will bark and whine toward the house to come in. Now, at first, I just figured that they wanted to get back into the house, but now I'm thinking they're actually scared. 3 nights ago, when I went out to get them, it was already dark, but we have a security light, so it isn't pitch black. I got to the front of the first kennel and noticed that both dogs were being quiet, and they always bark at me excitedly when I go out to get them, but they were dead silent, and this weirded me out a little, but not to the point of being scared. I will admit that there was a certain uneasiness in the air though, something I can't explain, but it sort of felt electric, like I was about to be shot. The longer I was there, the more uneasy I felt. I started getting the first dog, the lab, out, and heard a heavy snap in the woods near the kennels. I froze. The dogs froze, and by this time I was so on edge that if someone had spoken, I would have jumped, screamed, and possibly ran. The creepy feeling in the air just kept getting thicker. The lab had her bushy tail stuffed underneath her and was whining, and this didn't make me feel any better. The pit was as far away from the woods as she could get, whimpering for me to come get her. I can only take 1 dog at a time in because they get too excited and will sometimes try to fight, so I try to avoid that at all costs. I felt so bad leaving the pitty there by herself, but I had to do it. As I walked away, she barked, this high-pitched whining type of bark at me, and I have never heard her do that before, and the lab couldn't get to the house quick enough. I went back for the other one and dreaded every step, as her door is right at the base of the woods. I would have to turn my back to the woods to open her door and get her out. The air felt heavy and stale, with an unpleasant smell like a dead skunk as I approached the kennel. Another snap, and I was about ready to run for it, but I didn't want to leave my dog, who had her head down defensively, facing the woods. I could barely make it. To be honest, it felt like trying to walk through water. I was terrified by the time I reached the door. I heard a heavy breathing behind me as I got my dog out. She was scared too, and started growling behind me. I was frozen in place. The breathing continued for a minute before I heard steps that started coming towards us. We both took off at the same time, and a terrifying scream came out of the base of the woods. I didn't dare look back, I just ran. My pity pulled me all the way back to the house. I got in, flipped off all the lights, and stared out of the windows at the woods. I could see something moving slightly, but just out of the light. It moved back and forth for about 5 minutes, and then it disappeared. It took me forever to fall asleep that night, because I was so scared that every little noise freaked me out. The next night, I went to go get the dogs earlier, right around dusk. I thought it was all good until I was getting my pity out. A huge snapping sound, like a tree branch had just been snapped in half, rang out. It sounded pretty far away, so I just hurriedly got my dog in, started toward the house. A few steps away from the kennel, I heard something big start charging toward me from inside the woods. We ran again, and it appeared to follow for so long, and then retreated back. Now, every night since then, I hear sounds coming out of the woods, like branches breaking and being thrown around, knocking on trees and roaring. I'm absolutely terrified. I no longer even put my dogs in the kennel anymore. I just take them out for walks during the day and make sure we are all in before dusk. I don't know what to do. I'm thinking about buying a gun, but I'm not sure it will help. To start off this story and give a little insight about me, I am an 18-year-old female who grew up in Michigan and have lived in the country for as long as I can remember. And for heads up, this is a long story, so bear with me. Now, back to the story. On one particular hot summer weekend, me and a couple of friends, including my boyfriend, let's call him Tony, and my older brother, and we'll call him Brad, decided that we were going to go camping for the weekend since it was such a nice warm week. Tony's parents had owned a cabin way out in Ludington, surrounded by a huge wooded area with a personal lake and no neighbors for at least 4 miles. But being stupid teenagers, we really didn't think about that. All we were ready for was to party like any normal teens would. Well, after being there for 2 hours, our fun had started. Tony's friends had brung lots of alcohol and weed to last us for the weekend, so we wouldn't be bored since we had no service and only movies to watch. After it got around 12 a.m. and it was pitch black, we had a huge bonfire going. There was a total of 6 people there, including myself and Tony. As we talked and laughed about upcoming events in our lives, we were so distracted that we didn't notice that my brother had literally frozen his eyes onto one section of the woods. Mind you, we were all intoxicated and high at the time. Eventually, our talking ceased when Tony realized his friend and my brother had an emotionless expression. "Hey dude, are you alright?" he asked Brad. Silence. Brad didn't reply or even make any movements that would indicate he heard him. After that, I started to get scared, as well as the other 2 girls there. It took a lot for my brother to act that way. Eventually, I was the first to catch on that he was excessively staring into a certain spot under the tree line. I turned my head and followed his gaze best I could. And when I finally caught on to what he was staring at, my heart dropped. Right fucking there was, at first look, a dog. At least that's what I thought. It was some person's dog that had wandered off. But then my brain kicked in, and I realized that there weren't neighbors for miles. So how could there be a dog? My mind started to race while Tony still tried to get Brad to speak or even move. In one motion, this thing stood up tall. And when I say tall, I mean fucking gigantic. It had to be at least 6 feet tall. Everyone saw it then. How could you not? The other 2 girls and the other boy gasped as they finally grasped the concept of why my brother was still as a stick. No one moved for what seemed like hours. Tony was the first to talk. No tail, he mumbled. Not one heard what he said but Brad, and I swear to you, I say this, his eyes opened wide, as big as pan saucers. That freaked me out immediately. "What did you say?" one of the girls asked. "It has no fucking tail," he hissed at her. My heart stopped. He was right. There was no tail on this thing. Suddenly, my clouded alcohol mind cleared up in a fraction of a second when I finally realized what this thing was. Now I understood why my brother was basically shitting his pants. This thing was a skinwalker. My instincts kicked in right then and there, but before I could nope the fuck out of there, this thing let off a terrible stench like rotting meat before screaming inhuman-like. The sound was enough to scare the fuck out of everyone. My brother was the first one up out of his chair and started shouting native words to the creature while I told everybody to get the fuck inside. No one questioned me when they saw just how dead serious I was, especially Tony. He's never seen me so scared, so he knew it was a bad situation. We hightailed it into the cabin with my brother in tow, still shouting native words at the creature, which seemed to keep it at bay for a while. It gave us enough time to get inside. He slammed and locked the door before turning off all the lights and grabbing a special ash from the kitchen counters and started throwing it at every window and door while chanting. Of course, he had everyone freaked out and basically in tears at that moment. After he was done, no one said a word for a long time, all of us still in shock. He grabbed our dad's pistol and had it posted with him for hours. Everyone was entirely too shaken up to even question what had happened. We must have fallen asleep eventually because I woke up to my brother packing all of our stuff into the 2 cars early the next morning, and I understood why. You see, we had a native family. We knew what we were dealing with, and we knew it could come back, and maybe not alone. Before we left, I did a blessing on the cabin and spoke a few calming words to the still very freaked out girls, and we left as soon as everything was packed up. To this day, we still haven't explained exactly to our friends what happened that night, and they never bothered to ask us either.
Mostly because I grew up in northern Ontario and it's rare to see it mentioned on the internet at all, I was shocked to read a post by someone which detailed their experiences on a camping trip around the area I'm from. I had read the post simply out of curiosity, but some of the things written in it stood out to me. When I investigated the comments and found out the author was describing the exact area in which I grew up, I certainly hadn't expected that. Ontario's gigantic. What are the odds? My blood ran cold. First, I think I should provide some background. As I said above, Northern Ontario constitutes a large area of Canada and even Ontario. Besides this, it's sparsely populated. The towns are small, few and far between, linked only by the Trans-Canadian Highway, and between them, long swath of dense, dark forests. Maybe a few trails for skiing, but largely uninhabited. I grew up near these forests, but didn't really venture into them too much until my dad bought a large property when I was about 10. The property was gigantic, about 500 acres, dirt cheap, and mostly forest or exposed rocks that so characterizes the Canadian Shield landscape. Someone there had owned horses, so there were 2 very overgrown fields, grass up past your head, and a couple chicken coops. It even had some trails running through part of it, from the house to a large river where we could go swimming in, to an abandoned mine shaft, and connecting to the backs of other properties. Despite the worries of bears, and I can't count how many bears I've come across there, I hike these trails nearly daily. I always loved the outdoors, and there was nothing I liked better than being alone in the middle of nowhere. Not another human in sight. Of course, I brought my dog Rudy with me for safety. He was an expert bear chaser. Mostly these walks were uneventful. I would get to the river, take a swim, and head back home. The walk there and back took about 2 hours. The creepiest part was probably the last leg to the river. You would break out of the forest to some rolling plains which were bare due to the large power lines up. You would take the trail along these hills parallel to the forest until you reached the water. There was a loud droning hum in the air the entire way, due to the power lines. Besides that, complete silence except for my own voice. I always sang on the trails. It was a good way to warn bears away from you. The thing about bears is they don't want to fight you or even be near you. If you give them a good warning that you are approaching, they usually clear out. Some people play radios. I would sing. The first thing that I can remember happening was that I was walking along the hill path singing like I always did, and the droning silence behind my voice was broken by a weird bleating sound. Rudy took off running towards it immediately, so I followed him cautiously. I thought it might be a deer or something. So I was intrigued. For how large the property was, I never really saw a deer on it except once, which I'm getting to, so I was curious. When I caught up to Rudy, he was cornering the path next to the woods, barking furiously. I hung back a couple yards because it immediately became apparent to me that this was not a deer. I couldn't see what it was, but I could see the bush thrashing wildly, the tree branches swinging low to the ground. Whatever it was, Rudy had frightened it back into the cover. But the size of the animal required to make that large of a racket had me suspecting a bear. It wasn't retreating, but it wasn't about to continue forward, so I turned around and headed home. The next day I was in the house, and it was near twilight. I had an unspoken rule: I never went outside after dark. You would be stupid, too. Everyone has stories about a relative attacked by coyotes after dark, or coming in between an aggressive bear and your garbage can, so I stayed inside. I was on my balcony reading when my brother pointed out something in the fields to me. The fact we could see this thing at the all was amazing. The grass in the field was high due to the years of neglect, but there it was, this massive buck. He was enormous, at least 8 feet tall. We thought it might be a moose at first, but his face was far too delicate looking. And there was no mistaking those giant, sharp antlers. He stood in the field, gazing at our house, not moving as the sky darkened. It must have left in the night. My brother was angry the next morning. He was woken up several times throughout the night as Rudy had been barking at something. He reported hearing an odd noise, but was mostly just mad at the dog. I didn't think anything much of it. He thought he had chased away the deer or something. Inspecting of the chicken coops when we went to feed them before school revealed that some of our hens were missing. And we found the feathery remains of one of them a yard or so away from the coop, on the edge of the horse field. Maybe Rudy had been chasing away raccoons or foxes instead. I don't know when this happened, but it was sometime after. On our way home from school, the bus dropped us off on the edge of the highway, and we would have a long walk home down the driveway. We looked down the side of the path and saw something standing about 200 meters away. I went to see my brother last week, and I brought it up with him because it had been on my mind since I read that post. I asked him if he remembered that time we were walking from the bus and we saw something. He said yes, laughed a bit, and I asked him to describe it. It was tall, white, on 2 feet, he said. See, I thought so too. I remember it being on 4 feet at first, and then standing up until it was on 2. I remember it was white. It was white. It looked a bit like a deer, and we saw it, and it must have seen us because it just walked away into the woods on 2 feet. I don't know what it was, though. Did you ever see it again? No. I had, though. For a while I kept hearing the weird bleating noise at night, and our chickens kept disappearing. Then our ducks went, even though they were locked into a coop at night. Then the feral cat colony in the barn started being picked off a couple at a time. I dreamed about messed up animal once around that time. It was an animal that began as a crane, flying low to the ground, and morphed into a decaying centaur-like creature as it stumbled to the ground from flight. It shapeshifted, tumorous and bruised. It was screaming in that bleating voice, almost like a human, but not quite. Sniffed the air blindly, charging at me. I woke up just as it touched me. I don't know what it was. Maybe I was just upset by the cats disappearing and our livestock going, and I had a nightmare about it. Maybe it was nothing. I'm not here to say any of this was something supernatural, just that it happened and that it was weird. Eventually, we stopped hearing the bleating noises at night. I stopped hiking. I moved away to go to school. When my boyfriend and I visited my dad at his property, and I took him for a walk, he said the place gave him the heebie-jeebies. Why? This feels like prime Wendigo country. What the hell's a Wendigo? I'll tell you what a Wendigo is, now that I know. Back in the day, if a community became cut off from food, they might resort to cannibalism in order to survive. But it caused madness. It was also called Wendigo sickness. Was it only a legend created to explain these people who would resort to eating family and friends? A Wendigo is a witch. Ojibways and many other indigenous people have a legend about Wendigos. It is a witch. It was a person that desired power so badly that they paid a terrible price for the ability to shapeshift and immortality. They became mad with corruption. They were always hungry and feed on anything, but above all else, they were cannibals. They are so old and wretched that they look like zombies in their real form, graying skin, narcosis, bloated bellies from gorging themselves on any flesh they can find. Wendigos are pure greed and hunger. They can shapeshift. They can turn into a person, into an animal. A masterful Wendigo can imitate a human voice or a baby's crying to lure you over, get you lost in the woods, then they strike. They can infiltrate a group and pick you off one by one. They mostly hunt at night. You are never supposed to whistle at night because it attracts bad spirits, Wendigos included. Northern Ontario is unceded indigenous land. Upon further investigation, I realized that my boyfriend was right. This was prime Wendigo country. I had been so preoccupied with singing to keep away bears that I had never thought about what I might be luring home with me.